Next, a closer look at the growing human toll Ebola is taking on the communities of West Africa. Sheri Fink has also been reporting from Liberia for the New York Times. In addition to her journalistic credentials, she's also a medical doctor. I spoke with her a short while ago over Skype from Monrovia. Sheri Fink, welcome. You've been writing some very moving stories recently, the overwhelming tragedy, but also some very tough decisions that the doctors have to make. Talk about that.
Yeah, one of the doctors here named Stephen Hatch, he speaks of it as Solomonic decisions, and really every day brings some of these tough choices. Ebola treatment units, in a way, they're kind of simple. There's not a lot of advanced care that's offered. In fact, it's sort of a protocol. Every patient gets a mix of medicines when they come in to cover things like, a co-infection with something like malaria. Sometimes, Ebola can reduce the effectiveness of the immune system. So people even get antibiotics, even though Ebola is a viral disease. So you would think it's sort of simple, fluids and some of these extra medicines, but in fact there are all these choices that have to be made. For example, if you have somebody who tests negative, but then they develop symptoms while they're in the suspect ward, well, then, it's possible that they still will turn positive. So do you keep them there and possibly expose them to other people who have Ebola in order to test them again? And, all these difficult choices come up, even with children. That's another example where, a parent tests negative, a child tests positive. So what do you do in that situation?
You wrote about a mother who died, a pregnant woman who died, and had to make a decision about what to do with the infant when it was born. You also wrote about another mother who lost an infant and how she struggled with an infection in her treatment.
Yes, I think these were two of the more really heart-rending stories. I guess there's stories like that every day, and they really sort of emphasize why the doctors and nurses who I've been chronicling for the last few weeks, they feel a lot of joy when people survive, but they get, over time, they realize that what the world has to offer for people who have Ebola just isn't quite there. So even take the pregnant woman. It turns out that Ebola is very highly, it's even more fatal in people who are pregnant. And, just the tragedy of that alone. This particular woman, they didn't know if she had Ebola. She hemorrhaged after having a spontaneous childbirth of an 8-month-old, 8 months into her pregnancy. And she went from hospital to hospital while she was still alive, while she was, struggling to survive. No hospitals would let her in because that's a kind of a classic presentation with Ebola, and highly infectious, obviously, if there's blood. So finally, the car with her parents and the lady and her baby make it to the Ebola treatment unit. And by that point, she had passed away. But the doctors and nurses had to struggle with this decision of, what do we do with this infant? They had no idea. Could the infant be positive? There's not a lot of science around that, or data or information, because we just haven't studied this disease as much as it would have been good to do. So they made the best choice they could. They sent the baby home with the grandparents and, with gloves, with formula, in the hopes that they could give the child a chance at surviving. The child died 3 days later, and then 2 weeks after that, the mother who had helped deliver her, the grandmother who had helped deliver her daughter's baby and had cared for the baby, ended up coming down with Ebola and dying in the clinic. So these are the sort of, like, if you stay there long enough, you see how this disease moves through families that way. And again, it's those high-risk contacts, the real contact with the body fluids,
right.
That seems to be the theme over and over again.
Just terrible. Finally, Sheri Fink, the last story you wrote, despite all this, is the surprisingly low numbers of patients being treated in these newest hospitals around Monrovia, where you are.
Actually, it seems to be a pattern across the country, and now we have the WHO saying that there really has been, they believe, a slowdown in that upsurge in infections. And they really emphasize it's not a reason to pull back on any of the plans, because because there are large swaths of the country that don't have treatment units. And that's part of what the U.S. is doing, is trying to build and staff these treatment units that are in distant parts of the country where there's not great surveillance. There aren't good options for people who have, no access to cars, no cell phone service, and also just these really bad roads, frankly. So right now, it's hard for them to be safe. You have a family member who's sick. If you have to wait 2 days to get somebody to get them to a treatment unit, or if they die, to have a safe burial, that's really tough. So what the numbers are suggesting is there's some positive news that some of these interventions that we've seen so much work on in the last few weeks and months may be starting to slow this epidemic, which is great news, but certainly not a reason to let up, according to the experts here.
Sheri Fink reporting from the front lines there in Liberia. We thank you.
Thanks a lot.